morning, everybody. I came all the way out here from San Francisco yesterday. It's only the second time I've ever been in Europe, so I'm a little excited to be here. My name is Rob Zazueta. As Andrea said, I'm with Intel. We were formerly part of Mashery. We were purchased just over a year ago. And I'm on the strategy services team. And what I like to say is the strategy services team helps our customers figure out how to best manage, market, and monetize their APIs by helping to identify a successful strategy that aligns with their business goals. Now, as part of that, that means that we really do care a lot about how these API platforms go with the goals of the business that is driving them. So from our perspective, the success of an API program is really measured truly and almost solely by how well it moves a business toward its goals. So if you can put an API program out there and you say, I'm just going to try this out, we're going to see what happens, we're going to hope for the best, that's not a strategy. You really need to think about how that API is going to move toward the goals of the business. And when we're talking about business, we all know what the goals are. It's money. Try to make as much money as we can off these APIs and try to drive that forward. Now, we've seen a lot of very interesting things going on in the industry lately. For example, ESPN, which is one of our customers, made a big splash recently in pulling back their open API. When they launched a few years ago, they had something like 4,000 developers sign up almost immediately and start building these amazing applications. Now, ESPN, if you don't know, is the sports, I think it's the Entertainment Sports Network. They're owned by Disney. They have a huge amount of money that's behind them. They provide a ton of data for American sports. And they got ESPN, ESPN2, and they were a cable channel. And when they opened this data publicly for consumption through their APIs, it was quite a big deal because a lot of small folks could start building applications that were more sports information driven. And it was a huge thing. And so they opened it to the wider market and participated in a ton of hackathons. It was great. And now all of a sudden they're closing that down. The APIs aren't going away. The APIs are still there, but they're having more of a partner focus. And a lot of that is driven by looking at the amount of money they were paying to go out there and put this stuff forward. This happened with Twitter. This happened with a lot of companies who are pulling back on their open APIs. They kind of saw what was going on out there and how much it was costing them to support that and how much they were getting on that return. And initially, these companies put those APIs out there because the strategy was, I want to expand distribution. I want to see what happens. I actually can afford to do this. I posit that not everybody can afford to do this. So when you start with your API program or you're trying to put it out there and you're trying to determine the success of that program, you need to start thinking about the goals of your business. You've got to think about how you're going to be able to monetize those APIs. And to be clear, monetize doesn't necessarily mean direct money. But as far as I'm concerned, there's really 5 models for monetizing your APIs. There's a ton of different ways you can do it, a ton of different permutations, but they all boil down to about 5. And the first one is the one that most people think of immediately when they start talking about monetizing their APIs. I'm going to charge for access. Either I'm going to charge on a per-call basis or I'm going to charge in some monthly subscription based upon the amount of calls you're making. A very common way for people to approach this. And it does work. It does work if your data has the kind of value that people want to pay for. And so I already talked about ESPN, another company is Sports Data, and they do this. And you can see that they actually have it, so they have their 3 different levels, premium, standard, and basic, covering all the different sports. And then there's the pricing for the number of calls available, the maximum number of API calls per month. If you need more than that number of API calls, you can call them. They'll charge more money. They're going to look for ways to better support you. But this is because there's a direct cost involved in having an API. And being able to go out there and charge for this makes a lot of sense. And the way that you measure the success of this particular model is, well, how many fat stacks of cash are you getting back from it? It's pretty straightforward. How much money are you making directly off that API? How many people are making calls, and how much is each call worth? Now, the good thing about this is it's very simple. It's very simple to plan for this, but not every API program is suited for being able to charge. And really the best way to figure out about whether or not you can charge for your data is to talk to the existing customers, go do some customer validation, do some customer research to see whether they're willing to pay for it. The direct market, the direct selling of your API is one of the easiest ways to do it, but it's also one of the most challenging because a lot of folks go out there, a lot of developers say, well, I want free data. Or I'm not seeing where the value is in this. It's just something that's going to enhance my product. I can't afford to do this. So one of the strategies around this is to start with something like a freemium model, give some data out for free at some level, just enough for developers to test it out, build their own POC, make sure it's working, make sure that they see the value of that data and they can start building on that value. And then once they've reached a certain level, start charging them for it. Another way to measure this, though, and this is a term I'm going to be using a lot, is through ARPU. How many of you are familiar with the term ARPU? Okay, stands for average revenue per user. It's a very, very simple calculation. You take the total revenue over a period of time or from a particular cohort of users. You divide that by the total number of users, you get your average revenue per user. It's very simple. And so when you're measuring the success of a direct monetization program, the ARPU counts quite a bit. I want to see what the average revenue per API user is. And you want to try to get that higher and lower. That way you get a better sense, not just how much revenue is being generated, but you get a better sense of how much revenue is being generated per user so that you know what you need to do. Do I raise the prices? Do I get more users? What happens if I get 10,000 more users? What happens if I raise the price by 10%? You can really start to get a much better idea of how much money you are making from your API or from whatever you're generating with a simple calculation. And I'm going to be using this quite a bit because you're going to want to use your ARPU to figure out how much money you're making per user compared to other users as well. So the second monetization model is using API access as an upsell opportunity. No doubt you've seen this concept of the bronze, silver, and gold packages. And the bronze package gets you so much access, and the silver package gets you so much access. This is the idea where in my bronze package, you get maybe the basic package of what's available, and in the silver package, you get the API. And in the gold package, you get the API plus a lot of nice enterprise goodies that might go with it. However you model that out with your different tiers, basically the API is one of those things that you can use to kind of goose somebody up to a higher level. That's the upsell opportunity. The classic example here is Salesforce. So I can go into Salesforce and I can build an app on their app exchange, certainly, and start selling through them and become effectively a partner and affiliate of Salesforce. But if you want to be a Salesforce customer, you also have the different package levels that you can purchase for your customers. And you can see down here at the 125, the most popular level, integration via a web service API is included. So this is great because if I've already got my own homegrown system and I want to be able to tie that to Salesforce's CRM, I can go ahead and purchase that package, and that might be a good opportunity for me. I might want to do it. But you see it includes some other things as well. It includes workflow and approval automation, report history tracking. You get your own private version of the app exchange. So there's a lot of other reasons you might want to go for that package. The API is just one of them. So when you're trying to measure this one, it's a little tricky. You want to make sure that you're, first of all, comparing the sales of the packages that include the API versus the ones that don't. So again, take that ARPU calculation, compare it to the number of users, the number of revenue, amount of revenue you're generating for those packages and the revenue per user on those packages versus the revenue per user for other packages, and see whether or not you can figure out whether those APIs are really driving the needle. When you're selling this, if you've got a sales team that's actually communicating directly with your customers, ask them at the time of sale to record the interest in the API. That's one way that you can measure whether or not people are actually going to care about the API, and that's why they move toward that package, particularly when that package includes so many other niceties. But even better, look at those API-enabled packages and figure out how much usage is being generated through the API by those users. And then take that cohort and look at the revenue generated by those users compared to the ones who are not using the API who might be at that package. That gives you a very clear indicator that the API is driving revenue. If you take that ARPU and the ARPU for somebody using the API versus somebody not using the API is 10% higher, you can make the argument, well, the API is actually driving 2% more revenue for this particular group of people. That's the kind of business case you can bring up anytime you need to make changes to the API, anytime you need to convince the executive team that you need to do something to it. You show them that cohort, you show them those numbers. How are they going to say no? And of course, you can continue to tweak that and figure out where you should put in your marketing dollars. Number 3, drive revenue-generating activities through your API. So now we're getting a little further away from the direct model. It's much more difficult for me to understand exactly how the API might be driving revenue. There are certain things that make a lot of sense. If my API is actually allowing applications to drive leads, and those are paid leads, and I can track those leads in my customer resource management system or my sales management system, and I can see, okay, this person came in through an API application, and they're now generating so much money. Okay, I can probably attribute that back to the API potentially. But there could be so many other factors that are coming in there as well. So it gets a little looser here, but you can still measure it. Another classical example here is Vertical Response. Vertical Response is an email marketing and online marketing company. Actually, it's the company I worked for before I came to Intel. And most email marketing companies actually work in such a way that they're not necessarily driving revenue directly through the API. So here's some use cases they have on the developer, their API site. contacts and lists, so I can update my contacts, I can pull them out of a CRM, and I can push them into vertical response so that I can then send email to them. Email marketing companies don't recognize revenue until an email has been sent, even when they're paying on a subscription basis. So once those emails actually go out, that's where the revenue is being recognized. Indirectly, the API, by pushing those contacts into the system, is potentially driving revenue so long as those contacts eventually lead to emails going out. But again, it becomes this tricky situation where I have to make sure that, okay, this person is an API user, they're actively using the API, they're actively making calls to push contacts through. Are they mailing more often than the people who are uploading a CSV through the website? Or are they uploading, or are they emailing as often as the folks who are doing that? What does that cohort look like? So again, I want to measure this by looking at the ARPU of those particular customers versus the customers who are uploading their data through other means. If I understand how well the folks who are using the API are generating revenue and how much they're generating, that will help tremendously with me, again, making the case for why I should be improving the API, why I should be trying to add to it, why I should be spending more time and money on it. You got to follow the complete chain of the application usage. So a lot of folks have open API programs where third parties are developing applications. They're asking those people potentially to push their contacts into the list or to do other kind of, to generate leads or that sort of thing. You got to make sure that you're attributing all of that data, that entire flow from that one application. Now, the reality is many customers will have multiple applications that they're working with. So it might not be just one application that's doing it. It might be several. So trying to tie it back to one application is going to be difficult, one third-party application. But certainly if you're tracking that and you're seeing those API calls and you're understanding, okay, well, this is impacting that, and you're kind of seeing that flow, and you build that in when you're building your API program, you can really start to see how that success can be generated and how you can measure that and make sure you're keeping track of that. And again, remember that not all these calls are directly leading to revenue, so measure the ARPU of the cohorts of API users versus those who are not API users to get a better sense of whether the API is actually generating revenue. Okay, number 4, we're getting really, really far away from direct revenue. Generating revenue and distribution through strategic partnerships and affiliates. Another very common way of doing things. I open my API so that developers can use that. They can take advantage of particular aspects of my API, but in so doing, they're going to be signing up new customers. They're going to be exposing me to their customers. Or, as we heard this morning with Lego, they're opening up themselves to a strategic partnership. And in order to enable that partnership and to create a tight integration, they want to make sure that they have that API in place. And there's going to be different things that they're being measured as part of that. In the case of Lego this morning, they were talking about the partnership with Warner Brothers. That was enabled by having that API there, by being able to exchange that identity data. Very simple piece of the API, actually very complex when you really get to the implementation, but very simple in the sense of being a single point of exchange. But the remainder of the data that you have is going to help also expand outward and help with that strategic partnership. Another example is FreshBooks. They do online invoicing and billing. They integrate with a ton of different folks, PayPal and Stripe in order to send that out, Google Apps so that I can collect that data and push it in and create those forms that are going to generate the invoices. All of these different integrations are the standard types of third-party integrations that you see either being built internally or by third parties. But these are all strategic integrations. They're all strategic partnerships. And they're not necessarily driving the same kind of revenue directly, but there might be a rev share opportunity happening there. It might be a situation where PayPal is actually splitting the transaction costs with FreshBooks because they actually see the benefit. They're not. That's not the case. But that's potentially the kind of strategic partnership you could create. And so by doing that, you might be able to generate more access or at least get that wider distribution by having your access to those customers. It's not necessarily directly driving numbers. It's just opening access and opening distribution. But to be clear, opening distribution and just having a wider group of people that you're marketing is not necessarily driving revenue, and it's not necessarily driving the goals of the business. It actually could create more problems if you have too wide a distribution because you got to deal with all the traffic that's coming in. You got to deal with all the new customers. You got to deal with all of that. And if they're not driving revenue, they're actually costing you money. So make sure that when you're working with partners, you carefully plan how you're going to measure this and what the goals are of this partnership. Make sure it's understood by both sides initially. Because as you're going and forming this partnership, you want to make sure that both folks are working toward the same goals and are able to support each other. And you want to make sure that you get access to the data they have. Because if you're sending customers to them as part of a mutual agreement, you want to make sure you're understanding how that's working and whether or not that's driving the needle for them, and potentially how is that data going to be pushed back into you and how that can better benefit you down the line. For affiliates, again, only ever pay for activities that are directly generating revenue. It's great they get this distribution through third-party affiliates, but again, if they're not actually driving revenue for you, you're spending more money than you're earning. Distribution is great only if it's actually driving more revenue for the company. Measuring the new partners that are brought in, go look at using something similar to Commission Junction or something along those lines that have those tags that when a new customer comes in through a third party, you're able to understand, okay, this customer came in through this particular partnership. Now let's look at the cohort of that particular partnership compared to this partnership or just the folks who came directly to my site and see how that's working in terms of the money they're generating in terms of their ARPU. So again, taking that same calculation but using just that cohort compared to other cohorts to make sure that it's actually working the way it should. This is a constant struggle. You have to be constantly staying on top of this. And you need to have somebody who's in charge of partner management to make sure that these partnerships are successful and are looking at this as a dashboard of metrics as you go along. And I already mentioned the ARPU again, it keeps coming up. That average revenue per user is the best way to look to see how successful these things are going. Because you can look at the overall revenue, but it doesn't tell you the whole picture. It's not until you actually look at the revenue per user and compare it to revenue per user from other channels that you really understand the overall. Finally, the last one, the one that probably generates the least direct revenue, but has a definite impact on your bottom line, is improving operational efficiency internally and also speeding time to market for new products. This is a big deal. Well-built, well-designed APIs help you build applications faster. It helps you innovate faster. More importantly, it helps you fail faster. You can take risks that used to be huge risks because it would take months to build an application. You'd have to give all kinds of special access to all of your data on the back end. Once you build a well-built API that's secured, properly managed, even with an internally focused audience, and you treat that internally focused audience as your customers, you can actually get all kinds of great benefits of having faster onboarding, deeper access into data with tighter control, and you can build those applications rapidly and test them and see whether or not it's going to generate revenue. Versus, well, maybe this is a good idea, maybe we can do it sometime in Q4, we'll see. Comcast is a great example of this. All of their stuff internally is now built on APIs. When they would work with new partners or when they work with new applications inside the company, and they're a huge company, they were finding that it was taking months just to get something up and running. In some cases, it took them 3 months, or a month in this case. They've told me in the past it's taken several months to get partners onboarded rapidly. So they go from 4 weeks lead time to just a few hours to get somebody onboarded. It goes now from several months to build an application to a week or two, because their APIs are built in such a way that they have tighter control over it. They can go ahead and expose that data in a way that makes more sense for their customers and for their internal teams, and they can actually build these applications, get them up and running, see what's going to happen. If it doesn't work, not a lot of time has been wasted, not a lot of money has been wasted. They can move on, and it doesn't impact the bottom line too badly. Measuring this one is really tricky. You got to start by looking at how things are working now. So even before you start building these APIs, you have to see what's going on with your teams. How long does it take to go from the idea of a product, actually not even the idea, the inception. Everything's been approved. We've decided we're going to move this. We've decided we're going to start building it. Here's the requirements to the development team. How long does it take to go from the time you pass off those requirements to the development team to the time it's actually live? I have seen in well-built internal APIs, it go from several months to just a couple of weeks. And Comcast is not the exception. They're not some outlier. This is a very common scenario. So well-built APIs can do this, but you've got to make sure you're measuring this up front. Review the existing processes for provisioning access to the data on the back end. If you have to go in and create an Oracle user with some kind of special ACL in order to allow them to access that, and then I got to get the JDBC if I'm using Java or some other kind of connector, and I got to get all this stuff connected, that takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of time just to get those connectors working properly. Versus, here's a set of resources that are available on the internal network. Here's your API key. Go ahead and mix and match these as you need to build an application. That level of provisioning goes much quicker. It's literally, here's a key, here's the documentation, go. So review the existing processes and see how long that's taking. And then look at how you can decrease the numbers of the time to market, not just by looking at the API, but also just in how you change how you do everything to begin with. Going with a more API-focused, resource-oriented way of looking at things, notice I didn't say surface-oriented, resource-oriented way of looking at things actually can change the entire way that you look at how you build things and how your entire company can run. Now, I've talked about 5 different models. It's important to note here, though, you don't have to choose one. You can mix and match. Build your own model. Build something that's going to work for you. You can either use all 5, you can pick the 2 or 3. You might have a couple in place right now, and it might be working for you. Go explore and see whether you can apply some of these other models to your API to generate more revenue. The goal here is to build a successful API program that moves the business toward its goals. And a program that doesn't do that is not going to be successful in the long term. And that's it. Oh, there we go. Thank you very much.
Thank you.